Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I am Megan Arisman with the McCombs Plus program. We provide coaching, manage plus projects, and provide training and development webinars just like this one. This webinar series is part of our webinar series sponsored by McCombs Plus. I encourage you all to check out our Canvas page. This is where you're going to find all the future dates and details of upcoming webinars and workshops, as well as find recordings of previous ones. You are also going to receive a link to an evaluation survey following this webinar. We really appreciate all your feedback, so please make sure you go ahead and fill that out when you receive it later. And today we are pleased to welcome our wonderful McCombs Plus coach, Dr. Allison Alford, as she presents her webinar, Ask Better Questions. Dr. Allison Alford has over 14 years experience teaching university courses, and her specialty is training others in conflict resolution techniques, teamwork, meeting facilitation, and people skills for leaders. As a communication coach, Dr. Alford has worked with professionals and MBA students in the fields of engineering, tech, publishing, human resources, sales, finance, and more. She believes that anyone can improve any aspect of communication with effort and energy. Dr. Alford holds an MA and a PhD in communication studies from UT Austin, as well as a BA in international studies from Texas A&M University. She currently lives in Waco, Texas, where she's a clinical assistant professor at Baylor University and also owns Good Talk Communication Consulting. When she's not working, she enjoys reading podcasts about business topics, drinking an obscene amount of coffee, which I can relate to, and taking long walks with her kids and husband. Please welcome Allison, and we'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. You know, there's really nothing like being introduced. It really does give you kind of a natural high. It's like, oh, that sounds so good on paper. I am really glad that everybody could join us today. And I know there may be some coming in a little by little, but we're talking about how to ask better questions. And one of the things that I like to do is make sure to point out that this webinar and more webinars that I've done in the past and these plus talks or podcasts that I've done in the past are available on our Canvas page. So make sure you're exploring every aspect of that Canvas page and listening to some of those plus talks. And I have another one coming up soon, so you won't want to miss it. And as Megan shared, I do all of the things she mentioned and have been a coach with McCombs for almost 6 years now, but I also own my own firm, Good Talk Consulting, and you can find more information about me there. But specifically, you can schedule a coaching session with me right there on my website in that blue box that will link you right to Calendly and my account and get you set up right away for some coaching. So today, we're going to go ahead and get onto our topic and get started. And this is a rhetorical question, so you don't have to unmute or do anything with it. But I want you to ask yourself, how comfortable are you asking questions? Give yourself a score. Give yourself a rating. How comfortable are you asking questions? Now, I'm not sure what popped into your mind, but there's probably a specific context that you're picturing yourself in. And that might be asking questions in a team, asking questions in a classroom, or asking questions when you're going to a recruiting event, right? There are a few of these different scenarios that are likely popping into your head. And we're going to talk about those various scenarios today and some different ways that we can think about question asking in general. So our agenda for today is first to investigate why we should ask questions. And maybe some of you, when I said, how good are you at asking questions, you thought, I'm a zero because I never ask questions. So we need to talk first about why you should ask questions and what's important about this communication skill. The second thing is that we're going to look at types of questions to ask, and I will give you some very specific prompts that you can use, tools that you can have, and you'll even see some slides that say screenshot this. So be aware that that's a good moment to take a picture and use those questions in the future. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to phrase your questions, and of course, how not to phrase your questions or what not to say, which are always some good reminders that we need to have. Okay, so we're going to start with that part one, why you should ask questions. And ultimately, we're going to look at these two specific contexts today. And those contexts are questions about being in the context of being a student. Again, you could ask questions of your local government. You could ask questions in your relationship. So there's lots of ways we could think of questions, but we're focusing on these two elements today. How to ask questions more effectively as a student. And that includes being a student with the professors who are giving you the information, or as a classmate with your team members. You do a lot of team projects, or even thinking about how to yield the floor in class. It is speaking one-on-one with professors and recruiters, and it's also growing your ability to accept feedback, right? So different types of questions may be informational, and some of them may be soliciting feedback. The second context that we're imagining today is about your professional life. So some of you may be working full-time, you may be working part-time, or you are just coming off of a professional experience, or you're about to head into a professional experience. So our second context is about asking questions as a professional. And so the difference there is the student context is our non-professional cap, and then our professional life is really as someone in our career. And questions might be related to mentoring others, so those who you are supervising or coaching. Questions might be related to performing or doing something well for your supervisor, generally communicating with colleagues, or connecting with clients and other key stakeholders. So we're going to go over a few of these different scenarios. When you start to think about it, asking questions really is a massive topic. I mean, it's just huge. And so as we go along, if you have a specific context in mind, or you have a specific question about questions, that's meta, not Facebook meta, just meta, then please feel free to type it in the chat and or ask Megan, and she'll help facilitate that as we go forward today. Okay, so what is it that stops us from asking questions? Maybe you know that you're supposed to be asking questions in class or with a recruiter, and something is stopping you from asking questions. This is one of the key coaching topics that I often get. I work with students on how to ask questions in team settings, how to ask questions in class, and how to ask questions in recruiting settings. And what I've noticed is there's a lot of anxiety, and that anxiety is related to sometimes fear that we're going to not ask the right kind of question, which means that we need to expand our sort of question vocabulary. Another source of that anxiety is maybe we have a good question and we know what that question is, but we're worried about what other people will think of our question. Will they think the question is valuable, or will the person I'm asking think that I'm wasting their time by presenting this question? And then there's the common occurrence of the inability to formulate a question in the moment, which causes that panic, or a concern that the question isn't good enough for the specific arena. And arena might be graduate school, and with that we might be talking about some imposter syndrome, right? About whether or not we're really fitting in, or we're really doing things the way that others around here do it. So you might resonate with some of these reasons that you feel hindered or blocked from asking questions. And Sarah DeZita at IDEO is this really cool design firm, and they specialize in design thinking. So not just the products that they create, but how to think creatively. And she says, if we think a question is dumb because we don't feel that we have the right to ask it, we don't ask it. But you know what then happens? We wait till we're more comfortable to ask it, or we ask a friend, or we text someone, or I'll insert this here, maybe you email your professor a lot of questions. But all you're getting from this extra difficult work of going around the moment or losing the momentum of the moment, all you're getting from that is not the answer to the question or not the benefit of asking that question in the moment when the time is ripe. So why should we ask questions? There are lots of great reasons that we want to be curious people. And the first is that question askers are participating. So you probably have seen in some of your classes that your professors may even count the number of questions that you ask, or they may ask you intentionally at the beginning of the semester to be question askers, and that is a form of participation. Or you've just noticed that it's the norm, that question asking is part of the culture. And so if you are a question asker, you are seen as actively participating with intent. And it also means that you're seen. Okay, the professor sees you, they get to know you, your peers see you. Some of you might be sweating right now because you're thinking, I don't want to be seen. But there is value to it, especially when we know that someone else is soliciting this participation from us. Another reason why questions are beneficial is that our peers perceive us as confident, and we can put off a persona or an aura. And of course, it's not just peers. It's a lot of the people that we ask questions to, they perceive us as confident when we're able to engage in that way. And when we ask questions, we're able to get a lot of good things back. We can either get our question answered in the moment that we have it, or we can get feedback about ourselves, right? Because there's certain types of questions where we're soliciting feedback about ourselves or our performance. And lastly, this is potentially the most overlooked reason to ask questions, which is that others feel valued when they note that you're interested. So that's a great dating tip, right? Is go on a date and ask a lot of questions, because people feel valued when you ask about the things that they're doing or the things that they're interested in, or you want to get their take on something. So when we look at these things that we mentioned about potential anxiety or difficulty, and then the benefit, the result is what we see is that question asking is a trade-off between drawbacks and benefits. And I say this because it's important to me to frame question asking as something that takes effort. It takes intent. It takes work. It's not just some beautiful thing that you're going to add and it will be easy and, well done. I want to acknowledge that there are often barriers to overcome, barriers inside of us, cultural barriers, institutional barriers, or the ways that we're pushing ourselves. So it's valuable, but there are some difficulties with it. And by acknowledging that, I hope that you see that this is, that we're trying to be realistic about how to ask questions and when to ask questions, and give ourselves a pat on the back for any effort we make in this direction. Okay, so this is the end of part one, and I thought at the end of each part, maybe it would be good to take a moment here, and this is a great moment for you to ask a question if you have one, but to also tell you a little bit about myself. And so I dug up this picture of me in grad school, and that was at UT in 2014, and I was running a conference event that we had. And the truth is that I was really good at asking questions in class, but for a bad reason. And that reason was that I rarely did all of the reading. I'm admitting it to you now because I already have my degree. They let me out of there. And so, if you can't blame me now. But the fact was that I was busy. I was working to pay my way through school as a mom, and I did not have time to complete all of the reading fully. And so what I would do, my one trick, was to try to ask a question early in the class period so that I could show interest, and also so that I wouldn't get called on later. I want you to know that sometimes question asking is a strategic tool, and we can use it. We can put that, as one of our communication devices or tools that will help us out in situations if we use it strategically. Okay, don't tell anybody else, especially not any of my professors, about that bad habit. But feel free to use it if you need to. All right. Let's move on to part 2. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have them, again, feel free to put them there. What are the types of questions that we want to ask? And this is the section that will also contain these sample questions that I have for you. We want to ask questions that are real, that they're good questions, right? Better questions. That's why we're here. Ask better questions. So in the book, The Art of Asking by Terry Fadden, there are 3 types of questions suggested for use by managers. And these slides will be on Canvas later, and so you can use this link to buy it directly or certainly just Google it. But the 3 types of questions that managers use are questions that we ask because the answer is important, questions that we ask because the question is important, or questions that we ask because the process of asking is important. So I want you to look at this and think to yourself about which of these interests you the most. Okay, you have recruiting events coming up. When you have a recruiting event coming up and you're speaking with a recruiter, for example, you might have just a really great question about the organization and you just really want to know. But in most of my coaching, I found that's not usually the one with the reason that we're asking questions, because they give us so much great information in their overview or on their website or in their emails or in their talk that we don't necessarily have a question like question number 1 where we need to know the answer. But question number 2 is asking a question because the question is important. That might be a type of question where I'm going to show some superior knowledge of the industry, of the organization, of the topic by posing a question, a well-primed question. Or lastly, we ask it because the process of asking is important. And with interviewing and recruiting, it's going to be mostly number 3, okay? The process of asking, getting into the circle, getting your time, pushing through the barrier of the difficulty or the awkwardness of interrupting conversations, or kind of wedging your way into the conversation, or at the end of an interview, making sure to ask questions. Most of these types of questions that you might find yourself posing are process questions. The process of asking is important. And because the process of asking is what's most important, we can get some mental relief, okay? The mental relief here is, if it's not that I need a specific answer, if it's not that I'm trying to ask the coolest question this recruiter has ever heard, then really I can just ask a mostly good, not bad question, okay? What I'm trying to say here is you can give yourself permission to ask B+ questions. And a B+ question might be one that you found in advance and that you're going to ask no matter what the people are talking about. You're just going to ask this question because it's the process of asking that is important. So we're going to go through some, you might find them to be B+ questions. I think they're A+ questions, but by borrowing them, you're relieving some stress of preparing, and you are noting to yourself that it doesn't need to be anything special about the question. You just have to do it. Okay, so here's our first category. We're going to start with questions to ask guest speakers. And by the bottom of the screen here, you'll want to take a screenshot and borrow some of these questions. Let's look at what we have here. So you have a guest speaker, and a guest speaker, again, could also be a recruiter. It's just someone talking to a room full of MBA students. One thing that you could ask is, how have your assumptions changed about X based on the events of Y? Okay, so what we're asking here is to learn more about the guest speaker's thought processes. These are really great questions when we ask people to just share their own thoughts or feelings, because we cannot get that information anywhere else. And also, it should be a relatively easy response because we all have thoughts and feelings. And so they don't have to know any specific answer, like what's the square root of something? That's a specific knowledge question. You can make your question stronger if you root it within a context, okay? So if they came and they're talking about, event X, then you say, how have your assumptions changed about X based on Y, right? And Y could be COVID. Y could be, the changing politics. Y could be supply chain issues. You add a little bit of flair, and then you have a great question. But the base of the question is already prepared for you. Going forward, number 2, what trends do you see related to their industry that most excite you? And so this is an option when you want to get a higher level overview. And I think actually this is a great question where you do want the answer, right? You're asking for their expert opinion on a trend. And trends, those are sort of metacognitions when we look across functions and across jobs and across organizations to see what's happening in the world. But you should only ask questions like this if you believe they can answer it, right? You don't want to ever ask a question that puts someone on the spot and they're like, trends, never heard of it. All right, and so a very safe question is, how can a grad student apply these insights today? Okay, they just gave you some insights, they were talking. How can a grad student apply this? Okay, or what do you recommend that a grad student do with some of the information you've given me? Let's look at the next section. What are some resources that you recommend for someone who wants to learn more about trend industry jobs? Great. Resources are going to be a special book that they like, a podcast that they recommend, a person that they want you to reach out to. Maybe they'll just say something you already know, like be on LinkedIn, use LinkedIn, whatever. Go to these mixers. Maybe they'll say something, you already know it. It's a simple answer. But guess what? You get a check plus because you asked a question. And maybe they'll tell you about a great podcast you've never heard about before. Another one is, what's the biggest challenge facing your team, your organization, your industry this year or in this season of whatever, okay? So we look at challenge questions, and this next one, number 6, opportunity questions. Those are some of my favorite questions that I have in my pocket that I ask anyone anytime, because it is really easy for me to remember this type of question. What's the biggest challenge? What's the biggest opportunity? And it's typically easy for the other person to answer, because they usually know right away the things that they're bothered about at their workplace and the things that they're excited about or looking forward to. So that's a win-win type of question. Now, number 7 is a question where this is that the posing of this type of question is important, right? Because in number 7, we're going to pull something from what the guest speaker just said. You said something briefly about X. Can you say more about that experience? Ooh, cool. You noticed something, you heard something in what they were saying. So that is the type of question that can only be formulated on the spot, meaning it can only be formulated while the speaker is talking and they bring something up. So don't hesitate to take some notes as they're talking, and not just notes that are the things that they said, but the notes about things that you might ask. Okay, and so open-ended, available questions, when we say, can you say more? Say more is a wonderful invitation to get the other person to just talk about that topic in any way they please. It's very, very open, but also inviting. And so think about say more questions. I don't know about your professors, but as a professor myself, I love to use that. When students share some information in class, I'll just say something like, can you say more? What were you thinking? Just say a little bit more about that. Okay, and number 8, when I was looking at your website, book, podcast, LinkedIn earlier, I was intrigued by X. Can you tell us about that? This indicates I did my homework, I looked, and we ask it if they haven't brought up that particular instance yet. Okay, so I got some feedback from Benjamin. Number 7 is a golden question. Ding, 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 ding. I wish I had some special music for our golden questions. Make sure you screenshot this, or of course you can go back and watch it later. Okay, so what are some things that we need to consider about our guest speakers? I want to frame for you what we need to think about with our guest speakers that we should notice. First of all, they are there to help you. They really, really, really want to help you. So please don't feel like you're wasting their time, or that there's a question that would be too bothersome to bring up, or that isn't good enough. They really want to help in any way they can. And so it's actually our job to ask them questions so that they can feel like they helped us. So in essence, I want you to think, when a guest speaker comes, we need to ask them questions to show them how grateful we are that they came, and they help us and we help them feel good, and it's mutually beneficial. So of course, you should look up the speaker in advance if possible. If you know that a speaker is coming and you've been told his or her name or website, or there's a bio, or you can get on their LinkedIn and connect, look it up in advance. I'm not talking about a deep dive here. I'm talking about 2 minutes of looking it up so that you have an idea of what they're about, and then you're going to be able to think of good questions. On the same token, they've come here, they're being generous with their time. Make sure that what you're asking them is a softball. Now, what I mean by that is, we're not going to pelt them with our fastball question right to the face. We're going to gently lob them a question, especially if the question isn't really important to us. We're just asking it to ask. We want to make sure that we're not asking something very difficult or complex. Because at the end of the day, this guest speaker is a person standing in front of the room, and they don't want to be embarrassed that they don't know. Now, great guest speakers would just say, I don't know, I'll get back to you. But it's generous of us to not try to trap them into that situation. You should also be prepared when you ask us a question to know what to do with the answer that they give you. And what I mean by that is the speaker might start talking to you. It's not just ask a question and then we're done here. It's possible they might say, what do you think about that? Or does that answer your question? And so don't be caught off guard if they start talking to you and it's your turn to talk again. And so you might be prepared to say something like, that does answer my question. That's been something I'm curious about, and you really helped, spur some of my thinking. Again, all you need to say is, that's really got me thinking, and I'm going to keep pondering that. You don't have to have a phenomenal answer and keep talking or keep asking more questions. In fact, you shouldn't. You should yield the floor, but you should know that you might need to respond. Now, as I give these scenarios, there's such a wide variety of people that we're talking to here, right? You're looking around your classes and there's a really wide variety of personalities and preferences. So to some of you, I'm saying, let other people ask questions. And to some of you, I'm saying, ask more questions. To all of you, I'm saying, ask better questions. Let's move on. These are questions that we might ask our peers. So another situation where I have had many coaching sessions is, how do I get a word in my teams? When we're sitting in a room, we're having this sort of scrum meeting, and I feel like I get overwhelmed, or I can't get a question in, and everything just swoops past me, and then all of a sudden the meeting's over. And so these are some questions for you to think about with your peers. And by peers, I mean students that you are working with in class projects typically. If you're the leader and you're leading a meeting, please recognize that it is your job to ask questions of your team, not dictate the entire day, the entire meeting. So a team leader can indicate leadership through asking questions. What do you think is the most important piece of this to focus on? So maybe we went around the room and said, okay, what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? What do you have? Okay, what do you think is the most important piece for us to focus on? You might say, what can you commit to if you're trying to hold people accountable to deadlines or to pieces of the project? And at the end, you could also say, what did I leave out? Anything we should be considering? Anything else you want to bring to the table before we're done here? These are really important ways for making sure that not just things get done, and that things get done by dividing them up and everybody, does their bit and then you bring them together and paste them together and that's the project. No, this is real teamwork when you ask questions. That's when a team becomes a cohesive unit. Okay, if you're struggling to be heard in the meeting, what are some questions that you can use? Well, in addition to asking questions, I always recommend if you are a shy or quiet person, or you're very, you have trouble being diffusive, I want you to try asking these questions and also use your hands to make yourself a little bit bigger to get the attention of people in the room. So I want you to say, can we take a step back for a moment and regroup? I want you to kind of wave your hand, okay? This disrupts the system and kind of has a little pause button and lets things, restart in a different way. Another idea is that you say, what if we just each wrote our best idea on a piece of paper and then shared it? It's like if you're in a jury, right? And the jury is deciding the outcome and everybody writes their choice first silently and then pools them together. And this can really help with conflict situations. This is called nominal group technique. But don't underestimate doing some solo time even during the team time. And lastly, you might say, hey, can you say that again? Man, I really want to take that in. All eyes are on you, but you've also effectively given a compliment to the other person. And you're resetting the system here and letting some new energy take place. When the energy is not going well in a team meeting or in a group, reset. Press pause. Okay, here we go. Here's the last section on this slide. What if you really want serious feedback or advice? Okay, this is like go deep time. If you would like some advice from a peer or a colleague, from another student, you might say, if you could give me one piece of advice, what would it be? I'm going to be honest with you. I want to shoot you straight here. Be real. Most people are not going to say, go for your dreams, or make sure to take time out of every day to really enjoy life. No, they're not going to give you advice like that. That's just sweet and general. When you say to someone, what piece of advice can you give me? They're usually going to tell you something that you need to change. So be ready. So the first one is like you're asking and allowing some criticism. And it's good to become uncomfortable with criticism or more comfortable with the discomfort of criticism. And another question you could say, if you kind of want some compliments or you at least want to know what is going well, what do you consider to be my top strengths as a teammate or a colleague or as the leader of this organization, or et cetera, whatever role that they can speak to. So what do we need to remember about our peers? And this is, I think, so important. One of my favorite things about the McCombs experience is the diversity of thought, the diversity of personality, the diversity of global experience. And so I want all of you to remember that there are many social and cultural differences at play. And because of those, we each have different expectations. And so we can make room for other people, and we can give grace when things are not the way we expected. And sometimes the person we need to give a little bit of slack to is ourselves. Give yourself some slack. Don't count yourself out. The dominant person who's dominating everything, and they're asking every question, and they're in charge of every team, and they're telling everyone what to do. It's not the only way. It's not the only way. And it's not the best way just because you might see it a lot. And you can ask questions and change the way that it is. And you can do it a different way, a valuable way. And so lastly, I want to make sure that when you're asking for serious feedback from your peers, ensure that you have built up that trust. The person you're asking is going to be sensitive with you, but also that the information you discuss is going to stay right there. Okay, so we're not just going to go to anybody that we're in class with and ask them for critical feedback or advice. We want to be discerning about who we open ourselves up to, because criticism is difficult. So now we're moving on to an exciting one, which is, what should we ask our supervisors? I may have made that sound more exciting than it actually is, because sometimes I have to, really pump myself up to go ask my supervisor questions. But the book, Perfect Questions for Coaching Employee Performance, this is one, I have it right here. This is one of my favorite books, everybody. And there's like 10 of 15 of these perfect phrases books. I love them all. But in this book, Laura Poole, the author, she says that we can ask our supervisors questions related to vision, roles, and feedback. And so a vision question is projecting into the future, what you envision us being capable of achieving. A roles question is, what do you see as my role here? And how can my role support yours? Which is also much better than just saying, how can I support you? Which might sound a bit personal, intimate, but how can my role support yours? That's about, how can we work effectively together? And lastly, feedback. How do you think I handled this meeting, this client call, this slide deck? And you're going to get some feedback. In this book, there's like 1,000 questions. Every single page has a list of questions. I love it. So make sure that you purchase that book if you would like it too. And I want you to also know that related to coaching, I have a podcast coming soon called Coaching Employee Performance. And of course, it's applicable for many of you who will be or have been or will be managers and need to coach others and ask good questions of others. All right, moving on. What are some of our considerations about our supervisors when we're asking them this question? First of all, do your supervisor a favor. Set up the meeting in advance and clarify that you intend to ask questions. This is not, we don't just see our supervisor in the hallway and say, what is our vision for the future? It's not going to go really well, and you might not get great feedback. So just let them know, can I come by for 15 minutes? I'd like to ask some questions, about what's been going on here, or about how I can perform better. Just, set it up. Let them know it's coming. Do not go to your supervisor just fishing for compliments, okay? Go to your supervisor for genuine feedback. Hopefully, some is good and some is constructive. And that's what we want. We want to continue growing and improving. And then you need to follow up on what's been given to you. And so my recommendation is, the first form of follow-up is you send an email summarizing what you heard your supervisor say. And then if you're really awesome, you will set some specific performance markers of how you're going to work on that and get back to your supervisor on those performance markers. I think we have to move past this slide because I'm like mesmerized by this hand moving. So we have to get ourselves out of the trance. So this is the last one, the last specific person or type of person that we could ask questions to. What are some questions for our professional colleagues? Well, these are somewhat similar, right, to the way that we might ask our student peer colleagues, or things that we might ask our supervisor. The first one, what in your opinion went well on our last task or project? Of course, you can imagine that we could ask the opposite question too, what could be improved? Don't ever say what went badly. Everything is just improvable, okay? And the second one, I love this question. I love this question because it's kind of fun. It's kind of silly. If you could wave a magic wand and make anything different around here, what would it be? Wow, if you ask this question, watch out. You get the most interesting answers. And sometimes I have asked this question with sort of a leading intent because I want to see if my colleague friend thinks we should change the same thing around this place. And that's not often what I hear back. And so we're noticing different things in our workplace. And so asking your colleague what they think should be changed or different is really be a way to connect and see things from a different perspective. And so the last one here is, what are you struggling with that I could help ease the burden of? And again, don't ask this question unless you're ready to help. And even if you can't actually help with the tasks, you might be able to help with some encouragement. So when we think about our professional colleagues, again, we want to make sure that as we select which colleague to talk to, that we have built trust with that colleague. We're going to see that colleague 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week for the next several months. Don't bring up something awkward. Don't make it awkward. Make sure there's a level of trust there before going into the sticky feedback. Also, I want you to know that sometimes question asking can come across as competitive. Well, I have an 8th grade son, and you know what he likes to do? He tells me all the time what his friends got on all their tests. And so you're not asking your colleagues questions like, what did you get on the test? What did you get for your performance review? What did the client say about you? Those are not the questions we're talking about. The goal here is not to foster an environment of competition. I like my karate guy. And lastly, when you ask a question and your colleague is responding, listen actively in that moment. That's your entire job in that moment. Active listening means eye contact, nodding. It might mean taking notes. It means saying, okay, yes, sure. That's it. Active listening is our ears and we look like we're listening. Then you say, thank you. Thank you for responding honestly. Later, if you would like to reply, not argue, reply or unpack some of what they've said, you could do that either another day or in an email, not in that moment. Don't ask your colleague a question and then start arguing with the things that they gave you. Again, that's not going to foster that environment that you're hoping for. So we have to use some restraint. There's a lot of emotional intelligence involved with asking questions. And I know you know what emotional intelligence is, but the two main components, I'll just cover it for you. The two main components are noticing and understanding the emotions of others. And the second one, the hard one, in my opinion, is controlling my own emotions, controlling me. So I'm going to make sure that I just listen actively, and then later I offer, I respond to those or unpack them a little bit more. Okay, so we're moving on. What are some questions that we should not ask, you might ask? Well, we do not want to ask our peers, our supervisors, our colleagues, and definitely not the guest speaker or our professors, questions that you can find the answer to on Google, I should have added, or on the syllabus. If you can Google this question, like, how's your company doing on the NASDAQ right now? Don't ask them. Don't ask them questions that you can Google. It really doesn't show a lot of respect. And moreover, it's not going to go anywhere, right? It's not a question about their thoughts or their interests or their expertise. It is a Googleable factual question. We also want to avoid yes, no, or closed-ended questions. Like, do you like your workplace? Yes, next. Those types of questions, again, they sort of waste our opportunity, and we want to maximize our opportunity. We don't want to ask questions with a negative or rude subtext. Now, I covered this a moment ago when I said that we don't want to be competitive with our colleagues, but we also don't want to be rude or competitive with our professors or our guest speakers. So we would not want to ask a question like, why did your organization lose $1 million last year? You know, that's so rude. It's got a rude subtext. The other question that says, what are some challenges facing your organization, might acknowledge that I know there are challenges, but I'm being sensitive in the way that I ask. I'm being subtle. And the last one that we have here is, we should not ask someone questions that are answered by someone else. This is actually really important for when you're talking to recruiters. You might want to be a, Scrum Master, okay? This is a really cool and interesting job I just learned about recently. Maybe you're a program manager, you're a project manager, Scrum Master. The recruiter who comes is from that organization, but is perhaps not in that specific field, okay? And so we're not going to ask detailed day in the life questions of this person about a job they don't know anything about, or they know very little about, right? So we want to make sure that we ask questions that this person can answer. Okay, and so I see a question from Scott, and I like this question. He says, what about if you were the CEO, what would you change? Now, Scott, I want to ask you, and you can unmute or you can respond in the chat. Are you saying that this is a question you're suggesting, or are you saying this is a no-no question? What's the subtext here?
I'm sort of on the fence with it. I've used it in interviews to great effect. And you kind of almost have to read the room, I think, if you were to ask that. You have to sort of build some rapport first before you do it. But you don't want to get a gotcha thing, but it does always provoke a really interesting conversation.
Yes, and to I wasn't sure if I can't remember if I read the question aloud 10 seconds ago, but Scott wrote, if you were the CEO, what would you change? And I think that this is a challenging question, because when we say the CEO, everybody's picturing one person, right? Mm-hmm. So what I might do myself is say senior leadership or in the C-suite. And in this way, there is a bit of letting the person off the hook of sounding like they are criticizing this one person versus recommending changes at the leadership level. So I might change it in that way. Okay, thank you for chiming in. That's a great question, great idea. All right, so let's keep going. And we're at the end of section 2. So I want to share with you one more story time. And this story time is about a little bit more about me. And the confession that I have to share with you is sometimes I am an over asker. Now, maybe you can just tell just from my personality in this presentation, but I'm curious about people, and I like to know things, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit nosy. And so sometimes I'm an over asker. And we're going to get to the next section, which is about how we should ask questions, and also a little bit about how not to ask questions. So I want to remind you, feel free to put some questions in the chat if you have them about specific questions to ask or how or best practices, okay? So we're moving on to section 3, doing okay on time, got 10 minutes left, so hang on. All right, part 3, how to phrase your questions. Well, I really liked this from the same book, The Art of Asking by Terry Fadden. These are 10 rules for asking questions. And these rules are touchstones for what to do. And so the first one is to be direct. And by be direct, what we mean is also be, so there's nothing we're reading between the lines, but we're also being succinct. Well, we kind of get to succinct here later on. Number 2, make eye contact if you're asking the question in person. So if you're there in the room with a guest speaker, look them in the eye as you ask the question, not like, I'm looking at my notes and I wanted to ask, look them in the eye and ask the question. Also use plain language. You don't need to be flowery. One of the important things to notice, to know about verbal listening, oral presentations, it's much harder for people to listen and figure it out and then process an answer and then respond. That's like 4 parts of hearing someone's question. So when you use plain language, I'm not saying dumb it down. I'm saying just make the question simple and clear. It's easy for the other person to answer. And we make it easy on them, we make a smooth experience between us. So we want a simple sentence structure, and that will convey our sentence quickly and clearly, and we're keeping our sentence brief. We're keeping our question brief. We want to keep our questions to one topic, right? Now, I did give some questions where it was, what do you think about this based on this and this? Well, I would only do the based on this and this, based on X and Y, if the speaker had already brought up X and Y, right? Meaning they already have it's already on the table. Otherwise, I'm not sure a connecting 3-dot question is as helpful as possible. And so we're going to keep the purpose clear, meaning, are we asking because the asking is important, the answer is important, or the question is important. No subtext about tripping someone up or, well, I was hoping that if you got into this, you would, maybe I could move this into being a job or something like that. Nothing with subtext again, or hidden motives, I guess I should say. Then the question is appropriate for the person and the situation, as we mentioned. By situation, we mean we're not raising our hand in front of 100 people and saying, yesterday I talked to so-and-so and I wanted to ask you about my specific job and my discussion with so-and-so. And then the way that we ask should reflect our intentionality, and we have to know what to do with the answer. So some of these things I've presented to you, earlier in this presentation. So these are what Terry Fathom says to do. And here are some things that I want you to think about not doing, right? Or what I mean with that list of to-dos. Okay, so here's number 1. Keep it simple. How many questions have we heard that have a whole framework behind why the person has asked the question, or are connecting so many different topics, or are connecting things that happened the other day that the speaker doesn't even know about? Keep it simple. One of the things that I like to think about for myself is the idea of topic sentences. And this relates to number 2, starting with the main idea. A topic sentence, when we're writing a paragraph, is the point of that paragraph, the point I'm trying to get across. I want questions that are like topic sentences. Very clear, easy to understand, and they're obvious what I'm asking. And I'm not going to hedge. Hedging is like, well, I guess this is, I think you know what I mean, right? So I'm talking about industry, but, well, maybe sort of get rid of all of that stuff. Don't add an entire backstory that centers yourself. What I mean is, this shouldn't be a question with your life story. The question, in most cases, should be about putting the spotlight on the responder, on the other person. You don't want to ask questions that are leading. You've already led all the way down the path to what type of answer you want. Those aren't good questions, because they're a bit of a trap for the other person. And the last thing that I want you to remove from your vocabulary forever and ever and ever after this is priming. Priming is when you say, well, this is probably a dumb question, or I bet you've heard this a million times, but, or a totally different type of priming that I hate is when people get up in front of a room for a presentation and they say, I really didn't have a lot of time to think about this, but you're just priming us to hate the thing you're about to say next. Don't do that. Don't do it to me. Don't do it to yourself. Okay. Instead, just ask the question directly. And so how can we make sure that we're asking good questions directly? We need to prepare in advance. So don't hesitate to prepare in advance. Get your materials ready before you go into that situation. Think about it in advance, write them down, practice asking them somewhere else, and take those questions with you. Now, I do want to acknowledge, based on what I was thinking just over the last few minutes about Scott's question, is that one of the things that we really did not talk about today is questions that you could be asked in an interview, like star story questions, how to respond to those. And we didn't talk very much about what to ask at the end of an interview. But I think mostly some of the questions that we talked about for guest speakers would apply in those cases, where you say, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are the trends? How can a grad student apply these? What would you say is the features of an ideal candidate? Those are some general questions, and a coach can help you work on more specific questions that are tailored to your needs. So I am really grateful that you joined me today to talk about asking better questions. And I would love to talk to you one-on-one in coaching experiences. Again, you can reach out to me at my email address, drallisonalford@gmail.com, or head to my website, goodtalkconsulting.com. So that's it for today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, everybody. If you have questions, feel free to stick around.
Hey, Allison.
Hey.
This has been Bridell. I just want to thank you for presenting here today. I work in talent acquisition, so I can maybe answer like what Scott was bringing up. Like, would this be a relevant question?
I'd love that.
And everything else. Yeah, those golden rules that I mentioned, I thought were really important. Like when I'm interviewing people, I find the most relevant things are something that someone's like listening to, like we just talked about it, like, hey, this, versus someone coming with like a scripted question. And then the CEO question, I apologize if you hear things in the background, remote. But with the question of like the CEO, that always puts people in like a tough spot. And Scott, yeah, that does bring for a good conversation, but like 90% of the time, like the recruiter's just trying to get through. So that question I would probably recommend for the next round, because that recruiter might say, oh, I don't know, or it just might be for a good conversation. But yeah.
Context.
Yeah, I think the good point you're making there, Ben, is that there are, and this was part of the golden rules, that different situations or settings call for different questions, and we should acknowledge in the job application process, when we start with recruiting and then we're going to first round, second round, third round interviews, we have to change and upgrade our questions as we go. And that's not to say that our recruiter questions are low grade, but they're more generalized and more about, in some ways being charming and appearing to be somebody that you want to get to know. Whereas later in the process, several rounds later, we have to demonstrate critical thinking. And so that's a different type of question. All right. Well, success, I think.